Something has happened recently that, at first glance, looks like just another geopolitical headline, but it's not. It's something far bigger, far more calculated, and far more dangerous than most people realize. In fact, if you truly understand what just unfolded, you'll start to see a pattern that completely changes how you look at the balance of power in the world today. Iran has openly threatened every major Gulf port, lifelines of global oil and trade. And yet, the United States has not responded in the way many expected. That silence is not accidental, it's strategic. And the real reason behind it is something most media coverage is carefully avoiding: China. Now here's where it gets interesting. The story you're hearing is being broken into pieces: Iran's threats, America's silence, China's rise, presented as if they are separate developments, but they're not separate at all. They are deeply connected parts of the same unfolding reality. And the reason so many people are missing the full picture is because no one is putting these pieces together. So, in this video, I'm going to walk you through this step by step. Not because it's complicated, but because once you see how these three forces intersect, the simplicity of it becomes almost unsettling. First, let's begin with what Iran actually said, because the exact wording here is not just important, it's everything. On April 15, 2026, a senior Iranian military commander from the Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters delivered a statement that, on the surface, sounded like a warning, but in reality, it was something far more serious. He declared that security in the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman is either for everyone or for no one. Now, that line alone is powerful, but what followed made it unmistakably clear what Iran was signaling. He didn't limit the threat to a single choke point like the Strait of Hormuz. Instead, he expanded it across the entire region, saying explicitly that no port would be safe. Not just Iranian ports, not just contested waters, but every major economic artery in the Gulf. He named cities and hubs that form the backbone of global energy and trade: Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, Kuwait City, and even Ras Tanura in Saudi Arabia, the single most critical oil export terminal on the planet. This was not a vague threat. It was a deliberate message that if conflict escalates further, the entire Gulf's economic infrastructure could be brought into the line of fire. Now here's where things take a turn that most people aren't fully processing. Despite the scale and clarity of that threat, the United States has, as of now, not issued a direct or formal response. No emergency press conference, no explicit counter-warning, no clear military posture publicly communicated in reaction to this specific statement. And that silence is not because nothing is happening, it's because everything is happening beneath the surface. The blockade operations continue, the ceasefire technically still exists, and yet Iran has just signaled a willingness to expand the conflict from a single strategic choke point to an entire regional system that includes not just the Gulf, but potentially the Red Sea as well. And still, Washington has chosen not to respond in a way that directly addresses this escalation. That absence of response is not weakness. It's a calculated pause. And understanding why that pause exists is where the story becomes far more complex. Because the third piece of this puzzle, the one that ties everything together, is China. And this is the part that most coverage is either overlooking or deliberately under-explaining. Iran's confidence right now does not come from nowhere. This is a country that has endured massive military pressure over the past 46 days. Its leadership targeted, its nuclear infrastructure damaged, its military assets degraded. Under normal circumstances, a nation in that position would be signaling caution, not escalation. And yet Iran is doing the opposite. The reason is not that China is openly backing Iran on the battlefield or issuing joint military statements. It's something far more strategic than that. China has been quietly reshaping the economic and geopolitical environment in a way that gives Iran room to act, room to threaten, room to escalate, and most importantly, room to believe it will not face immediate isolation or collapse as a result. China's role is not loud, but it is deeply influential. And once you understand what it has been doing behind the scenes, Iran's behavior starts to make a lot more sense. So when you step back and look at all three of these elements together, Iran's sweeping threat, America's deliberate silence, and China's quiet but powerful influence, you begin to see a completely different picture than the one being presented in headlines. This is not just a military standoff. It is a layered strategic interaction between three major forces, each operating on a different level. And to truly understand where this situation is heading, you have to stop looking at these events in isolation and start seeing them as parts of the same unfolding strategy. What Iran is really saying here is far more calculated than a simple military warning. The message is this: if America continues its blockade, Iran will not keep the consequences limited to a US-Iran confrontation. It will expand the cost outward and make it everyone's problem. Not just Washington's, but the entire Gulf's. Your ports, your oil shipments, your economies, your stability. And that message hits very differently in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Doha, and Kuwait City than it does in Washington, because these countries are not direct participants in this war. Saudi Arabia did not launch strikes on Iran. The UAE has carefully tried to balance its position. Qatar hosts American bases, but has gone to great lengths to avoid being pulled into open conflict. For weeks, these states have been watching from the sidelines, with a sense of growing anxiety, hoping the war would remain contained, hoping it would burn out before it reached them. And now, Iran is effectively telling them publicly, officially, through its military leadership, that containment is no longer guaranteed. If the blockade continues, the conflict will expand to include them whether they want it or not. And the reaction from Saudi Arabia tells you just how seriously this threat is being taken. According to reports, Riyadh is now actively pressuring Washington to step back from the blockade and return to negotiations, fearing that continued escalation could trigger Iranian retaliation not just in one location, but across multiple critical shipping routes. Think about what that means. The very country the United States claims it is protecting, one of its closest strategic partners in the region, is now signaling that America's current approach may actually be increasing the risk to Saudi Arabia rather than reducing it. That is a profound shift. It suggests that Iran's strategy is working, at least at the level of psychological and economic pressure. By expanding the perceived battlefield, Iran is creating fractures in the alignment between the US and its regional allies, forcing those allies to reconsider whether continued escalation is truly in their interest. Now, many people might be tempted to dismiss Iran's threat as exaggerated or symbolic, but that would be a mistake, because the capability behind the threat is very real. Even voices that downplay Iran's conventional strength still acknowledge this. Yes, large parts of Iran's navy may have been degraded, but that doesn't eliminate the tools required to disrupt shipping. In fact, it barely touches them. Iran does not need massive warships or aircraft carriers to create chaos in the Gulf. What it needs, and what it still has in abundance, are fast attack boats, anti-ship missiles, naval mines, and drones. These are precisely the kinds of asymmetric tools that are most effective in narrow waterways and crowded shipping lanes. A single fast-moving vessel, a well-placed mine, or a coordinated drone strike is enough to cripple a tanker or shut down a port temporarily. And when you multiply that risk across multiple locations, the entire system becomes unstable. Iranian officials themselves have reinforced this point in very deliberate language. Senior figures have stated that Iran still possesses major untouched levers to counter the blockade. That phrase is not accidental. It is meant to signal restraint, an assertion that what we have seen so far is not the full extent of Iran's capabilities. In other words, Iran is implying that it has deliberately held back, and that the next phase of escalation could involve tools and tactics that have not yet been deployed. That shifts the perception from a country under pressure to a country that is pacing its response, choosing when and how to escalate. But perhaps the most critical and most dangerous dimension of this entire situation is that it does not stop at the Persian Gulf. Iran's influence extends beyond its own borders, particularly through allied groups like the Houthis in Yemen. And this is where the threat becomes global. The Houthis have already demonstrated their ability to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea, particularly around the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, one of the most vital maritime choke points in the world. For over a year, their attacks forced major shipping companies to reroute vessels, increasing costs and delaying global trade. Now imagine that capability being reactivated in coordination with Iranian pressure in the Gulf. If Iran signals that the pause in Red Sea attacks is over and Houthi forces resume targeting ships while Iran simultaneously threatens or disrupts traffic in the Gulf, the world is suddenly facing not one choke point under stress, but two. And that changes everything. Because together, the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea account for a massive share of global seaborne trade, energy, goods, supply chains that entire economies depend on. Disruption in one is serious. Disruption in both at the same time is something the modern global economy has never truly experienced. It wouldn't just be a regional crisis, it would be a systemic shock, one that could ripple through oil prices, shipping costs, inflation, and financial markets worldwide. And that is the real weight behind Iran's threat. It is not just about missiles or ports, it is about leverage over the global system itself. Now let me address America's silence, because to understand this situation, you have to be very precise about what that silence actually represents. It is not confusion, it is not weakness, and it is definitely not indifference. What you are seeing is a calculated pause in the middle of an extremely complex strategic situation. Right now, the United States is not dealing with just one variable. It is managing multiple layers of pressure at the same time. On one level, it is enforcing a large-scale naval blockade of Iranian ports, involving thousands of personnel and a significant military presence in the region. At the same time, there is a fragile ceasefire in place that is set to expire in just a matter of days. Parallel to that, there are indirect negotiations happening through intermediaries like Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Oman, with the possibility of direct talks still on the table. And beyond all of this, the US is also watching how countries like China and Russia are positioning themselves around the conflict, quietly influencing the outcome without directly stepping into the battlefield. In that context, a direct public response to Iran's threat becomes far more complicated than it appears. If Washington were to issue an official counter-threat saying that any Iranian action against Gulf ports would trigger further escalation, it would immediately raise the stakes at a moment when the US is still trying to keep diplomatic options alive. The blockade itself is already a form of pressure. Adding a strong public military warning on top of that could push both sides into a corner where backing down becomes politically impossible. And once both sides reach that point, escalation is no longer a choice. It becomes inevitable. So the silence in many ways is a strategic decision to avoid locking the situation into a path that cannot be reversed. But that silence comes with its own risks, and this is exactly where Iran's strategy becomes effective. Because while Washington may see silence as a way to manage escalation, Gulf states interpret it very differently. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait are watching the same developments unfold. They hear Iran explicitly threaten every port in the region, and then they see the United States not directly addressing that threat. And naturally, the question begins to form. If Iran actually follows through, will America respond in time to protect us? Or is America so focused on its direct confrontation with Iran, especially over the nuclear issue, that the security of Gulf infrastructure becomes a secondary priority? That uncertainty is not accidental. It is exactly what Iran is trying to create. The threat to Gulf ports is not just about military capability. It is a diplomatic strategy designed to drive a wedge between the United States and its regional allies. If Gulf countries begin to doubt American protection, they may start thinking in terms of self-preservation rather than alignment. They may explore separate understandings with Iran, informal agreements that ensure their ports and economies remain untouched. And the moment that happens, the unified front that makes the US blockade effective begins to fracture. Iran understands this dynamic very well, and it has been playing this game since the early stages of the conflict, selectively allowing certain countries to continue trade while restricting others, encouraging divisions rather than unity. And this is where the final and perhaps most important piece of the puzzle comes into focus: China. Because the real reason Iran can make such bold threats, despite being under intense military pressure, lies not in its battlefield strength alone, but in its economic resilience. Before the war began, Iran was already exporting a significant volume of oil. But what is remarkable is that during the peak of the conflict, when its infrastructure was under attack and global attention was at its highest, Iran did not see its exports collapse. In fact, in some periods, those exports actually increased. That should not be possible under normal circumstances. A country under heavy sanctions, facing military strikes and a naval blockade, should see its primary source of revenue severely disrupted. But Iran didn't. And the reason is China. For years, China has been building a parallel system designed specifically to bypass Western pressure mechanisms. Instead of relying on the dollar-based global financial system, China conducts transactions in its own currency. Instead of using major international banks that are exposed to sanctions, it relies on smaller, less visible financial institutions. Instead of conventional shipping channels, it uses what analysts call dark fleet tankers, ships that operate without broadcasting their location, moving oil quietly across international waters. And instead of large, highly regulated refineries, it uses smaller, independent facilities that are willing to process sanctioned crude without scrutiny. This entire network was not created overnight. It was built over years with one clear objective: to ensure that in a moment like this, when pressure intensifies, the flow of oil and therefore money does not stop. And that system is now doing exactly what it was designed to do. Despite the blockade, despite the military pressure, Iranian oil continues to move, revenues continue to flow. And as long as that economic lifeline remains intact, Iran retains the ability to sustain its position, absorb pressure, and project confidence. Now, this is the point where China's role stops being indirect and becomes absolutely central to understanding Iran's confidence. Earlier, I said that China is the reason Iran feels bold enough to threaten every major port in the Gulf. And that's not a dramatic statement. It's a structural reality. Because a threat like this is only credible if Iran believes it can survive what comes next. Think about it logically. If Iran were to actually strike a tanker near Dubai or hit a port facility in Qatar, the United States would not stay silent. The response would be immediate and far more intense than anything we've seen so far. So for Iran to even make this kind of threat publicly, it has to believe one thing above all else: that it can absorb that escalation without collapsing economically or strategically. And that belief comes from China. As long as China continues to buy Iranian oil, Iran is not cut off from the global economy. It still has revenue. It still has cash flow. It still has what you can call economic oxygen. The American blockade is designed to choke Iran's economy, to force it into a position where continuing the conflict becomes unsustainable. But that strategy only works if the pressure is airtight. And right now, it isn't. Because China has created a parallel system that keeps Iranian oil moving, regardless of Western restrictions. So yes, the blockade hurts Iran. It raises costs, it complicates logistics, it creates friction. But it does not trigger the kind of sudden economic collapse that would force Iran to back down on its core demands. And as long as that lifeline exists, Iran has room to take risks. But China's role may go even further than just economic support. Recent intelligence reports suggest that Beijing is preparing to supply Iran with specific types of weapons, particularly shoulder-fired anti-aircraft systems known as man-pads. These are not symbolic tools. They are highly practical battlefield weapons capable of targeting aircraft at low altitudes. Weapons like these have already proven effective in modern conflicts, and they are exactly the kind of system that can complicate U.S. air operations in the region. What makes this even more significant is how these transfers are reportedly being handled through indirect routes, third countries, layers of deniability. And when questioned publicly, there appears to be a disconnect between what intelligence agencies are reporting and what political leadership is willing to acknowledge openly. That gap between what is known and what is said is its own form of strategic silence, and it is a silence that works in China's favor because it allows support to continue without triggering immediate confrontation. To really understand why Iran escalated its rhetoric so dramatically, from threatening a single choke point like Hormuz to threatening every port across the entire Gulf, you have to look at what I would call a confidence ladder. This is not about sudden power. It's about accumulated confidence over time. Every time Iran pushes a boundary and does not face overwhelming consequences, it moves one step higher. Every time it tests the limits of escalation and finds those limits flexible, its willingness to go further increases. And that is exactly what we've been watching unfold. Look at the sequence carefully. Iran disrupted the Strait of Hormuz earlier in the conflict, and despite significant effort, the US could not fully restore normal operations. Iran then introduced selective passage, allowing certain countries, particularly those aligned with its interests, to continue trade while restricting others. That alone created divisions in the global response. Then came the ceasefire, but even within that pause, there were violations and continued pressure tactics. The US responded with a blockade, but almost immediately, there were instances where ships linked to China continued moving through the system without direct consequences. Each of these moments sends a signal, not just about capability, but about tolerance. And Iran is watching all of it. So when Iran now stands up and says that no port in the region will be safe, it is not doing so because its military position has suddenly improved. In fact, by many measures, its military capabilities have been degraded over the course of the conflict. What has increased is something far more important in this context: strategic confidence. The confidence that it can escalate step by step without triggering consequences that it cannot handle. And that confidence is being reinforced externally. Every barrel of oil that China continues to buy from Iran strengthens that belief. Every workaround that keeps Iran connected to global trade adds another layer of resilience. Every instance where China operates in ways that indirectly challenge American pressure, whether economically, diplomatically, or logistically, adds another step to that ladder. And over time, those steps accumulate. So when you look at this moment, this threat against every Gulf port, you are not looking at a sudden outburst or a desperate move. You are looking at the result of a system that has allowed Iran to absorb pressure while gradually increasing its willingness to escalate. Not because it has military superiority, but because it believes it has something just as powerful: the ability to endure. And as long as that belief holds, supported by economic lifelines, quiet partnerships, and strategic ambiguity, Iran can continue to act in ways that seem disproportionate to its immediate position, but make complete sense when you understand the deeper structure behind it. Now we arrive at what is arguably the most important question raised by everything that happened this morning. And it's a question that, surprisingly, almost no mainstream coverage is asking directly. If China is the reason Iran has the confidence to make such an expansive and aggressive threat, if it is China's oil purchases, China's quiet financial systems, China's potential weapons pipeline, and China's diplomatic positioning that are collectively allowing Iran to escalate instead of retreat, then the real question is simple. What is the United States going to do about China's role in all of this? Because right now, there is a visible gap between what is happening and how it is being addressed publicly. On one hand, there are strong warnings, like the proposed 50% tariff threat against China if it transfers weapons to Iran. But on the other hand, those warnings are being undercut by simultaneous statements expressing doubt that such transfers are even happening. And that contradiction matters because you cannot credibly threaten consequences for an action while publicly questioning whether that action exists. China notices that inconsistency. Iran notices it. And in a conflict defined by perception and calculation, those signals carry weight. But the issue goes deeper than just one statement or one policy threat. The broader question is whether America's strategy for ending this conflict even includes China as a central factor. Right now, everything appears to be focused on Iran. The blockade is designed to pressure Iran. The negotiations are structured around Iran. The ceasefire framework is built to contain Iran. But if you step back and look at the bigger picture, Iran's ability to sustain itself over these 46 days has not been purely internal. It has been supported externally. Its oil revenues have continued to flow. Its access to resources has not been completely cut off. Its diplomatic space has not fully collapsed. And much of that resilience traces back directly or indirectly to China. So if the strategy ignores China, it is effectively trying to solve only half of the equation. It's like playing a game while pretending one of the key players isn't on the board. And the reality is, China is far from a passive observer in this situation. It is actively shaping the environment in which this conflict is unfolding. It has reportedly been in continuous diplomatic contact with multiple sides, encouraging de-escalation when it suits its interests, while simultaneously maintaining its economic ties with Iran. It continues to purchase Iranian oil, providing Tehran with the revenue it needs to endure pressure. There are also indications of deeper coordination at the global level, with China and Russia aligning their positions and engaging in high-level diplomatic discussions that factor this conflict into a broader strategic context. And yet, despite all of this, the United States is still largely framing the situation as a bilateral issue, America versus Iran, rather than a more complex triangular dynamic that includes China as a decisive force. So what happens next becomes critical, and the timeline is incredibly tight. With the ceasefire set to expire in just a few days, the next 48 to 72 hours could determine not only whether this particular conflict escalates or de-escalates, but also what kind of regional order emerges afterward. If the United States chooses to respond directly to Iran's threat, issuing a clear and public warning about consequences for any attack on Gulf ports, that would signal a shift toward escalation, a decision to apply maximum pressure in the hope of forcing Iran into concessions before the deadline. On the other hand, if the U.S. continues its current approach, remaining publicly restrained while pursuing quiet negotiations through intermediaries, it suggests that Washington is still prioritizing a diplomatic resolution, even if that means absorbing a certain level of rhetorical escalation from Iran. But there is a third path, one that has not yet been fully visible in this conflict. If the United States begins to engage China directly as part of the solution, applying pressure on oil purchases, addressing potential weapons transfers, and integrating China into the negotiation framework, then the entire nature of the conflict changes. It stops being just a US-Iran confrontation and becomes a broader strategic contest involving multiple major powers. And that shift would signal that Washington recognizes what is really sustaining Iran's position. The truth is, from the outside, it is not entirely clear which of these paths America is currently on. That level of decision-making is happening behind closed doors, within a very small circle. But what is clear is that Iran's actions this morning were not random or impulsive. They were calculated. They were the result of 46 days of testing limits, observing responses, and building confidence step by step. Iran has been learning exactly how far it can push without triggering consequences that it cannot handle. And with each step, that boundary has moved further than many expected. So now the focus shifts. Watch not just what is said publicly, but how it is said and where it is said. Official briefings, military statements, diplomatic signals sent through intermediaries like Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt. These are the channels where the real direction of this conflict will reveal itself. And at the same time, watch China, not just its statements, but its actions, its silence, its continued economic engagement. Because in many ways, China's quiet consistency has been just as influential as any public declaration. What you are witnessing right now is not just a series of isolated events. It is the exposure of a system that has been built over years, designed to function under pressure, designed to operate without visibility, and designed to sustain exactly this kind of scenario. This war did not create that system, it simply revealed it. And Iran's sweeping threat against every Gulf port is not the beginning of the story. It is the result of that system reaching a point where it can finally be seen in full effect.